Hey Destiny, it's Mr. Wampler. I was looking at your questions, so I'm going to try to get you the answers, and then you can look it over, see if you still have any questions. We'll go through those, and hopefully you'll be ready for that test. So I would look to do a retake maybe around Tuesday, so that you're ready for the break, but ultimately it's up to you. The longer you wait, obviously the fuzzier it's going to get, the more questions you're going to have. But without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I noticed that a lot of your questions are kind of along the same concept, so I'm going to try to clear that up for you and then keep this pretty short. Alright, so the first one, it talks about explain the CCR5 mutation, how did it occur, what did it do? Alright, so you seem to be stuck there. When we're talking about natural selection, we use this as an example of natural selection among humans. So way back, long time ago, in Europe, we have things like the smallpox and plague. They're not really sure which one was the selective pressure, but the point was there were these huge epidemics where lots of people are dying. And as that occurred, you had some people with a mutation that just happened naturally, but this particular mutation removed, let's see if I can get these to show up. Yeah, alright. So it removed these receptors from the cell. And the function of these receptors is to grab kind of like packages, if you will. So like, alright, so Amazon sends you packages, you come, you open the door up, and you bring the package in. Same idea. And your cell needs packages, it needs things to survive. So the body will send it to the cell, and the cell will have a receptor, which are these things, and these black things right here. And they latch on to the package, and they bring it inside the cell. The bad thing is, the downside is that once they do that, once the virus gets in, it acts like a good package, and the cell says, okay, cool, you're a good package, I'll bring you inside. When it brings it in, then it pops out, surprise, I'm a bad guy, and it populates a whole bunch more of them until the cell kind of just dies and explodes, and now you have a whole bunch more of these going out all over your body. So it actually uses the cell to make more copies of itself, and then it kind of explodes out. Pretty sick stuff. So that's what happens in most people with HIV. The virus comes in, reproduces exponentially, it just keeps on reproducing, popping out, eventually you succumb to it. However, the people with this particular mutation, they didn't have, there are no receptors. And because there aren't any receptors that this HIV can bind to, it can't pull that into the cell. So without a receptor to bind to, without being brought into the cell, they're just kind of just, knocking on the city door over and over and over again. Nobody's home, you can't get in. So can't get in, they can't reproduce, and those people are resistant or immune to HIV or AIDS. So in Europe, about 10 to 15% of the population is highly resistant or immune to HIV or AIDS. And I think that's a direct result of that smallpox and or the Black Plague, one of those two, that reduced the population to a point where the only ones that survived were the ones with this mutation. It just happens to be coincidence that HIV happens to use the same receptor to get into the cell. So again, if any part of that was kind of confusing to you, go back again, play it over again. The main idea that a long time ago a disease killed off a lot of people that did not have that mutation, and because of that, the ones that did have the mutation survived, which meant they increased their numbers in the gene pool. There are more of them around, and now there are more of them around, those people are also, conveniently, immune to HIV as well. Alright, so let's move on. Okay, so how can the movement of individuals into a population help bring about natural selection and change over time? Include thoughts on how individuals could affect the gene pool. Alright, so we talked about how within a population there's variation, so different organisms have different variations of different alleles, and over time within that particular gene pool you can have more and more of a certain frequency of allele that's beneficial, and you'll have less and less of the negative alleles. So I brought a lot of vocab into that. So we have alleles, variation, mutations. I want to brush up on that before the test. But basically, let's see here. Let's see if the next slide goes to that. All right. So this is actually for both of them. You have a mutation. You can see here it had a genus C, and now you have that break. So a mutation of some kind. And that leads to variation. So now with these moths here, you have a white moth and a black peppered moth, or melanic. That's what they're called. So you have variation. So a mutation will lead to some kind of variation, and then natural selection will act on that variation. So again, you've got this. This would be predation. You've got a bird eating the white moth. All right. So you have natural selection of some form, whether it's selecting a mate, or like this here, predators, or just fitness, being able to have more babies. Whatever it is, there's some kind of natural selection that occurs that acts on this variation. And over time, that selection is going to lead to a change in the phenotype, or the allele frequencies. So again, you have an allele for a peppered moth, like a white one, and you have an allele for a melanic or black peppered moth. And over time, as these birds are eating off all the white ones, you're going to see an increase in the black ones over time. These X's are the birds eating the moths. So by the end of these generations, by the third generation, you have a very large change in that black allele frequency. Okay. So as far as movement of new individuals into a population, they can bring new or different alleles into a population. Typically, the larger a population is, the more variation there is in there, the more resistant it is to predators and that kind of thing, or being wiped out. Variation is a good thing. All right. And again, this is why I said a lot of your questions kind of are on the same thing. The next one says, what is natural selection? Well, that's kind of this guy right here. Natural selection is, again, whatever's happening in nature that selects for a given trait. Makes it beneficial or not beneficial. So in this particular case, it's beneficial. It's a good thing to be the melanic form of the moth, the black moth. So if you're pretending, let's see if I can change this color. I can, yeah. Alright, so let's pretend this tree back here is it's a black tree. Alright, so on this black tree, it's a lot easier for a black moth. Forgive my artistry here, my drawing. This is a black moth. Okay, so on this black tree, it's very easy for a black moth to hide, right? Which means it's easy to find the white ones. So natural selection is in this case, the bird is selecting for the black moth to be successful. He's not doing it on purpose. Just the black is harder to see, so nature selects for the white one to disappear. However, if this tree ended up being white, is there an eraser? Yeah, there is. Good time, awesome. Okay. Take all this out too. Alright, so let's say over time something happens and the tree becomes a lighter shade. Now the tree isn't as dark. And now that white one can hide really well. This is a white moth, in case you couldn't tell. Alright, so there's a white moth and the black one stands out. So now natural selection is going to pick for the black one, the black allele, to disappear. Alright, so you'd be eating a black one there. Is this making sense? I hope so. Alright. When are mutations passed on to offspring? Good question. Let's erase this. Okay. So, we're going to focus mainly on the mutation side of things now. This slide right here is probably a slide. Alright, so the only time a mutation is passed on is if it happens in a sex cell or a gamete. if it happens in a somatic cell, which is like your skin cell, anything else that's not a sex cell is going to be a somatic cell. But you're not using your somatic cells to have a child. It's going to be a gamete from the male and a gamete from the female that are going to make a child, a baby, an offspring of some kind. So only the DNA that's in the male sex cell and the female sex cell, if there's a mutation there, then you'll have a mutation in the offspring. But if, say, I had a mutation of some kind in a skin cell of mine, and then I were to have a child, the child's not going to acquire that mutation. It's only going to be if it's in a sex cell. So if you think that through, kind of makes sense, right? So if like you get your hand chopped off, well, people that have amputations still have fully functional children because the sex cell does not have any kind of effect from that. So the only time you're ever going to have a mutation passed on to offspring is if it happens in a sex cell. Alrighty. So gene frequencies. What are gene frequencies? Good question. Whoop, that didn't work. Alright, so gene frequencies. Let's focus over here. Or allele frequencies would be a better way of saying it. So, in this first, what am I doing? I'm getting ahead of myself is what I'm doing. In this first generation here, the allele frequency, again, you've got 6 moths here, 5 white peppered moths and 1 melanic or black peppered moth. So your frequency for a white peppered moth is going to be 5 out of 6. Your frequency for a black peppered moth is going to be 1 out of 6. These are going to equal 100% of the population. So you'll see that over time, the allele frequency for this melanic form increases with every generation. So your allele frequency is increasing. But overall, the population is still going to be 100%. So it's going to be out of 100%. Also here, a much heavier percentage in your third generation than in your first generation. But that's allele frequencies. Alright, what is Darwin's theory of natural selection? We've already kind of talked about it, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Darwin's theory of natural selection is the theory of natural selection we've been talking about. It's no different. It's just saying that, sorry, I'm getting distracted by these pens. Okay, it's just saying that you'll have a mutation of some kind, leads to a variation. It's going to be acted on by natural selection. Selection, as I said earlier, can take the place of, it can be mating, that kind of thing. So like when we saw the fiddler crab with the giant claw, okay, the females select for males with the biggest claw. So if you have a mutation that gives you a bigger claw, that's going to be successful. It's going to increase in the population over time. So you're going to get bigger and bigger claws, or more colorful claws. In this situation, you've got predation is one of those forms. There we go. There's my arrow. Goodness, that's terrible. All right. Predation. So it's a pretty easy one to see that over time, predators will narrow out the herds, and you'll have only the ones surviving that have the most beneficial characteristics. What would be another form? Just overall fitness. So if you have a mutation that allows you to have more children successfully than the others, then overall, over time, that would be passed on to generations. They would have more and more and more of that allele until you'll see a lot more in that overall population. Okay. Explain how you think chameleons might have developed their specialized adaptations. Anytime you get stuck on this kind of test, when we're going over natural selection and change over time, anytime you get stuck, the reason why I have this slide up here is that the basic formula for how things tend to change over time, how natural selection can change an organism from one species to the next, is you're going to have a mutation of some kind, leads to variation in the population, it will be acted on by natural selection of some kind, whether it's predation, finding a mate, fitness, that kind of thing, and that will lead to a change in allele frequency over time. So every time you're talking about how a change could have occurred, it's going to follow this general format. So chameleons changing over time. There was some kind, let's just say with the tongue, the long tongue. So you would have started with some kind of mutation, and again, it would happen progressively over generations over a really long period of time. But you would have had a mutation of some kind that would have given you a longer tongue, and somehow that would have given that longer tongued individual more of an advantage. And with more of an advantage, then he is going to be able to survive and reproduce and pass on that trait. So he has a mutation of some kind, and then that leads to the variation. So he's got a longer tongue, makes him more successful at catching prey, which keeps him alive because he can catch more prey. And then over time, because he's more successful than the other lizards out there, you're going to see an increase in his allele over time. And it's going to continue. So then maybe the next generation there might be a further mutation for a longer tongue. And it's going to keep on building on that over time. So you've got this ridiculously long tongue now that's shooting out and just catching things. But that makes it very successful. Chameleons aren't very fast. So the ones that have fast tongues that are really long can catch the prey while they remain stationary on their stick. Okay? Same thing for their coloration and everything else, the way they do with their claws. You could pick any of those things to talk about. But the key thing I'm looking for is, do you understand that random mutations that just happen, they occur, random mutations will create a variation of some kind, which will make it more successful when natural selection comes around, and which leads to the change in the allele frequency over time. That's your basic recipe for most of these questions in natural selection in general. So when you're talking about Darwin's theory of natural selection, you're talking about a mutation that happens randomly, creating a variation of the population, and then there will be natural selection acting on that variation, which will lead to a change in allele frequency over time. If any part of that is confusing to you, I would suggest you go back and review this, because this right here, the reason why I showed it to you, if you go back, I think it's mutations. Go check your Edmodo. It's mutations, I think 4 through 6. I have a bunch of slides like this to kind of bring home the point that mutations cause variations, acting on by natural selections, lead to a change in allele frequency over time. I hope that was helpful. I know it was a lot all at once. I'm trying to get you caught up for this test. Quick sound bites. If you have any further questions, contact me on Edmodo, and we'll talk about it. Good luck.